Thanks so much for your time. You've been meeting with your state and federal counterparts on reform during the recovery from the crisis, the COVID crisis. On Sunday, we heard from the Finance Minister, Mathias Cormann, who said, when it comes to the GST, we did have a very thorough look at this not that long ago, and the outcome of that work at the time was it wasn't in our interest to move in that direction. At this stage, he says, I haven't seen anything that would change my mind. What do you make of those sorts of remarks from the Finance Minister?
Well, Kieran, what I'd say is that progress wasn't made taking ideas off the table. And I agree with Mathias in the sense that we want to lower the tax burden. We've cut taxes here in our state by around $5 billion over the last 4 budgets. We want to provide an environment for our businesses to flourish so they can employ more staff and increase our economy here in New South Wales. But in essence, if you're going to be fair dinkum about tax reform, which we have to be at this time, then you shouldn't be taking anything off the table, because that then really hinders the capacity for us to get any meaningful reform off the back of it.
Does it frustrate you that the federal government is drawing a line, it seems, through the GST straight off the bat?
Well, I've had very constructive discussions, Kieran, with Josh Frydenberg in relation to reform, and they're open to that. You know, they've spoken about payroll tax in terms of the states abolishing that form of taxation. The reality here is, here in our state, and every jurisdiction across the country, we rely on inefficient taxes that hinder jobs, productivity and economic growth. And the reality is, if you look at revenues from a state and federal level, we have around $80 billion in revenues. The Commonwealth has around $500 billion. And look, we all have an obligation to participate in it. But if you're going to start taking things off the table from the outset, it's not going to help. We need to change the future, not just manage the present. And that means we need states and the federal government working together. But it becomes pretty unhelpful and difficult to actually get any reform up if we're going to start disqualifying things from being discussed.
Treasury analysis and most economists say, and you touched on it in that answer there, that there are many inefficient taxes like stamp duty, for example, payroll tax, which is a tax on jobs essentially. They're inefficient. One of the taxes that is the most efficient is the consumption tax. Why is this a blind spot?
Well, I don't know. And Kieran, we believe in lowering the tax burden. We just want a better tax mix. And this is a once in a 100-year challenge that we find ourselves in. And we need fresh ideas and fresh thinking, as the Prime Minister has said, to take our state and Commonwealth forward. And the reality is, if the states do well, the nation does well. You can't be in a pandemic in a situation like this and simply focus on the day-to-day polling. That is not what is going to get us into a much better place. We need to focus less on the media cycle, more on developing public policy that's going to take our state and nation forward. And if you're not going to do it in a pandemic, I don't think there's going to be any real chance. And as I've said to you before, we really have an obligation as political leaders to take on this challenge and do it well. And it's not going to be easy. Reform like this has rarely been achieved. The Keating years, the Howard Costello years. But the challenge we find ourselves in now is actually greater than it was at that time. So it's time for us to be working together, taking on the difficult issues, not focusing so much on what the polling is telling us or what the focus groups are telling us, but actually leading our state and leading our nation out of this situation. We have an obligation here to set our state and country up for future generations, and the judgment of what might come out in a news poll is less relevant than the judgment in 30, 40 years' time when people look back and say, well, what did they do to help drive our economy and productivity growth coming out of this pandemic?
And it seems to me it's not just the challenge, as you said quite rightly, a once-in-a-100-year challenge, but it's the opportunity of the consensus building that we've seen from National Cabinet, the wonderful achievements we've seen across governments on the health front. Why should it stop there? Why can't we have that consensus building into the economic recovery phase as well?
Well, it shouldn't, and it's not just the opportunity, as I said, Kieran, it's an obligation that we have. I've been very motivated by the fact that we've seen many treasurers right across the country, Labor and Liberal treasurers, working together on the reform aspect. And if we're going to do what's most important right now from our political leaders is to do what's right to set our state and country up for success. As you say, the National Cabinet, I think, has been a brilliant organisation in terms of bringing everybody together on the journey. Our Board of Treasurers and KIFA has done the same thing with the Treasurers. And if we can all work together on doing what's right, I think we can get some very good outcomes. But it will not happen if at the first instance we're going to play politics with it and be in a situation where we take certain areas off the table because we're a bit concerned about what the next the papers might say the very next day. We've got to be able to articulate a case, and I think the public is there, that they know that we're going to need to make some difficult changes to drive our state and nation forward. And when you look at the tax mix, there's a real opportunity right now to rid states of inefficient taxes that hinder jobs, productivity and economic growth, like payroll tax, like stamp duty, and look at a better mix that's going to set up our country for success.
Well, as you've said repeatedly, you've said it to me before and again today, this isn't just a political opportunity or a window of opportunity. This is an obligation. Do you get the sense that other leaders are willing to be bold right now in terms of the reform agenda? Is there that appetite for that?
Well, from my discussions with the Federal Treasurer, I really do believe that's the case. And it's not just about having the appetite. We're going to have to do this. So let's work together to get it done. It's game time. There's significant challenges that are going to confront us, not just now, but into the future. And if we can work together, and I believe we can, we're certainly doing that across the various state jurisdictions. Very constructive discussions, as I've said, with Josh Frydenberg. But we've got to. The only thing that COVID seems to have not pierced is the Canberra bubble when it comes to reform. Let's get out of the day-to-day media cycle. Let's get together and work on some policies that's going to drive our states and nations to future success.
And so, just finally, in your talks with the Federal Treasurer, have you raised the broadening or the raising of the GST rate, and what's been his response to it?
Well, my sense is that the Federal Treasurer is very open to tax reform and other reforms in terms of deregulation. I mean, it was just last week when it was announced that Australia was heading into a recession, Kieran, the Federal Treasurer pointed out quite clearly that it's going to be a business-led recovery, and that's going to come through reducing red tape, reducing regulation, governments getting out of the way, and tax reform, which is going to drive economic growth going forward. We're not going to have, and there's no crisis in the past, whether it's a war crisis or a pandemic crisis, that we've had a bureaucratic response that's led us out to future success. It's going to come from political leaders right across the country to sit down together, put political differences aside and put our state and nation's interest first and foremost. And I think, based on discussions I've had with the Federal Treasurer, that's what we will achieve. But in order to do that, what we can't do is take ideas off the table, or it'll be a race to the bottom and nothing will happen.
Treasurer Perrottet, appreciate your time. We'll talk to you soon.